Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Strategy Cafe. I hope you've got your coffee to one side and you're not distracted by doing something else, and we can just grab your ears and your attention for the next half hour while we dive into some really fascinating topics. Before we get going, and for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nick Mayhew. I'm founder and CEO here at Alembic. In a moment, I'm going to be introducing today's guest, Todd Kashdan. But before I do that, I wanted to remind you to check out and subscribe to our YouTube channels and our podcast channels for Strategy Cafe. The details are there on the slide. You can find such wonders on there as Professor David Dunaway talking about leading a team that separates neurally conjoined twins. Or you can find on there the former City of London Chief Superintendent Don Randall talking about leading on the day of the IRA bombings in London. Or you can find on there our team explaining about how to bury the dead cats, which is our process for solving rows and rifts in teams and families under pressure. So lots to go find. A brilliant resource for leadership, and I heartily recommend it to you. Go have a look and enjoy. So to Todd. For those of you who know my background will know that I have a deep interest in mindfulness and in movement and the impacts on our stress and mindset, having been brought up in a Buddhist center, experienced both rugby, Tai Chi, and meditation on the same day for a few years as a kid. But translating that into my adult life, I've got an MSc in psychology, neuroscience, and mental health, and I found Todd through a concept called psychological flexibility, which is at the heart of an amazing therapy discipline called acceptance and commitment therapy. And what Todd had written on the topic really integrated a whole life of disparate insights into a meaningful whole for me, and broadened and deepened the available techniques, which are available to all of us really for handling the challenging parts of our lives and for the whole of our lives in different ways. And what I love most about all of this is that it's also kind of countercultural, and culture can be such a straitjacket. Everything we're going to talk about today is really available to everyone who's listening. You don't need to buy anything, or you could buy a book or two, but you don't really need to buy anything. You can just do it once you're shown the way. So I'm delighted with that note to introduce Todd. Todd, say hello to everyone and tell us a little bit about you.
Hey everybody, Nick, thanks for having me here. I am the founder of the Wellbeing Laboratory long before it was cool, back in 1998 when positive psychology was kind of really getting kickstarted. And in those 2+ decades, we basically study everything you want to talk about at a party. Meaning and purpose in life, curiosity, creativity, friendships, happiness, flexibility, as Nick had mentioned before, anxiety, social anxiety, loneliness. We're basically realizes that to truly understand the human condition and optimize human functioning, you got to go back to Carl Jung, who wasn't doing any empirical research himself, and figure out how do you mix in everything that's the totality of you being human. There's a dark side, there's a really dark side, and then you've got these elements of light and strength and power. And I think when you mix these things together, there's sort of an alchemic reaction where people can actually reach not just greater potential, but have what Marcus Aurelius talks about, which is a sense of tranquility in your life for however it is you're walking through your life.
Wow, thank you. That's just beautiful. A perfect way to frame the discussion that's coming up. And before we get going, I am just going to share a poll. The question is, if you had an opportunity to remove anxiety from your life, would you do it?
Things we come up with between our sets of bicep curls.
I don't know how you're finding this. I think this is a really hard question, but maybe for some of you, it's a really easy question. The majority of you would remove anxiety from your life given the chance, but it's not obvious, right? I think that's quite a mixed result. Okay, so very interesting. It's such an interesting question.
Yeah. And I like that people are honest enough to answer exactly how they're thinking, because that's how you get these kind of like nice distributions here.
So having picked that as a topic to start with, I want to just leap off Todd's framing a little bit. Um, and forgive me, he's got this great summary at the end of the upside of the dark of your dark side. I'm just going to read it out, if that's okay, and we can maybe just jump in from there, Todd.
Sure.
So what you wrote is, you cannot banish the devilish, unflattering qualities of your personality, nor would doing so be healthy or useful. Suppressing experiences is psychologically destructive because it divorces us from the full richness of real life. To progress on your personal journey of love, meaning, and purpose in life, you need to become fully aware of all aspects of yourself, including your darker tendencies, and be agile enough to integrate them into your personal repertoire as needed. So we're going to talk about some specifics around particular difficult feelings, but I did want just to start with this really lovely, wide-ranging statement. There's a lot going on in there. So let's pick anxiety, and maybe just to your summary in that beautiful paragraph from your book, what do you mean by this?
Yeah, and it sounds so much better with an English accent added to it. It sounds that extra 3% of profundity. So the original name of our book was going to be The Whole Enchilada. And the reason why that works is because there are elements of the self that don't feel good, that are actually quite annoying. And your initial reaction when you think about what are other people thinking about me in a social situation is that they must be negatively evaluating me for this seemingly personal element of who I am that I think that they're viewing as a weakness when perhaps it's a strength. And so anxiety fits in perfectly. The natural cultural impulse, and I think, the UK is very similar to America, very similar to Australia and New Zealand, in that people that are high in anxiety or high in neuroticism or low in emotional stability, we view these things as negative things.
Right.
And the research is really clear is what situation are you talking about? What's the task at hand? And if you're talking about trying to give a speech or pop onto a podcast with a really highly intelligent host, and you're not feeling the butterflies, you're not feeling anxious at all, I'll tell you what's going to happen is that you're going to be, let's just say, for argument's sake, 10 to 20% less effective at extemporaneous conversation, speaking, responding to comments, polls that pop up that you never saw before on the fly. And also, you're less inclined to actually go into your memory banks and acquire those stories, insights, scientific studies. Like when you're anxious, there's a little bit of frenetic behavior in your mental library where you're searching for books and studies and stories and interesting facts. What will this audience that I can't even see be interested in? That behavior of information gathering, of synthesizing information is more adept when you have a little to moderate amounts of anxiety to when then you are calm and serene.
So, I mean, people will relate to that, right? And we all know, I think, there's this, cultural idea, right, that we should shoot for happiness. This is very present in the UK. I guess it's quite present in the US. I don't think it's everywhere because culturally these things are incredibly variable and people respond really differently from culture to culture, country to country. But in the UK, there's this kind of concept of shooting for happiness, which is quite novel, really. It wasn't around in the 1980s and 1990s so much. It's quite an alien term. And in the UK, you'd be told you're being too American, right? If you talk like that. To which the counterpoint was like, what would you do if you had an unhappy client, though, right? And oh, yeah, I'd respond immediately. So happiness is important to you. Okay, yeah, so it is. But you have this messiness, right? So where you sort of want to have the good stuff, you want happiness. And yet, you're saying it's really important for us to be motivated by our anxiety.
Yeah. So we could think about this as don't choose between process and outcome, which is very typically what we do in our workplace. No matter, I don't care how you get there. We want to raise money, increase the number of sales, reduce our budget, very clear outcomes. Process wise, it ends up being is that some of those tasks you want to be pretty anxious, and some of those tasks you want to be pretty calm. Now, there's no clear cut for these things, but just scientists need to do this in order to figure out like what works best when and where. So one of the things that we know is if the task requires playfulness, intrigue, high energy situations where you're looking for a collaborative environment, anxiety tends to be less effective. When the environment requires something that's serious, important, time urgent, anxiety tends to be your friend and makes you be more beneficial to be in that state. Now, here's the extra level of applied use for this kind of research. If you're in a time urgent environment, if you're in a place where you're a little bit in the hole and you're worried about whether you're going to be in the black or red in the workplace, anxiety is going to help you. But if a leader pushes you to be more anxious, you actually have an extra level of motivational boost to be worried, to be concerned, to be fearful. Now, all of a sudden, your anxiety moves from being productive to being a little bit malproductive in terms of functioning at performing at your highest level, being the best cultural citizen in your organization, and being creative. So if it's self-generated, tends to be quite effective in those difficult situations. If it's self-generated and someone's pushing you to go even further, it often actually backfires and makes it problematic.
Like, I get that completely. It's such a difficult thing to try and kind of pinpoint, isn't it? And I think one of the issues here
Yeah.
is that everyone has their own internal scale on this, right? So I don't think there's I recognize from the research there's a bell curve out there for the whole of humanity on anxiety, but none of us is that bell curve. All of us is like a dot that makes up that bell curve. We're all somewhere on that map, right? And everybody is a unique dot. So for some people, what you just said is absolutely right. But for other people, actually, the shared sense of anxiety is gonna bring more from the team and not push you over the edge. It's just what you need to up the energy level. But there's that tipping point, right? And so I think you make a great point that some bosses don't have a light touch on that, and they, regardless of what the job is, they hit everything with a hammer. So you definitely have that in some leadership styles where everything is hit with a hammer, regardless of how subtle you might actually want to do to get the right response out of somebody. So this sense of uniqueness, I think, and everyone's response being slightly different. On the chat, Jay has put a beautiful point, and I want to come to it in a minute because I think it's probably really well describing what people can feel. But before we get that, just like this point about optimization, in your book, there's this fabulous little study about people with more anxiety getting cut through. Tell everyone about, I don't know if you can remember the case, so I'm going to throw it at you and hope you can. People were given kind of a mock-up where there was an urgent message to get somebody to act, and then the group were distracted. There was a series of like minor bureaucratic distractions. Do you remember the story?
Yeah. This is the Israeli researcher, Dr. Ein Dor, who deserves a lot more attention. Really creative study. And it's basically is the experimenters created about a gauntlet of 7 tasks that a person had to go through, and they knew none of this as they were coming in. So let me just walk you through this kind of quickly. Imagine you're in this. It's basically walking through the real world if you travel to a foreign city and you get that culture shock and you have no idea what's going to hit you. So you walk in to get your money for the study, and as you're working on this computer task, all of a sudden smoke starts to appear out of the computer. And then the question is, what do you do? Because the researchers left the room. So the smoke gets more and more until the room gets flooded. If you leave the room to go find someone who can help you, no one's going to be in that hallway. So now you have to search through the building to try to search for maybe an IT person that can help you with this computer or the researchers. As you're walking through the hallway, gauntlet task number 2 appears where someone runs into you and they're carrying a stack of papers and they all fall on the floor. And the question is, do you help them or do you keep going towards your task to try to figure out this computer problem where the screen on the computer is saying, if this isn't helped, all of the data will be lost in the system. As you're doing that, you get to the IT office. It ends up being that the door is closed and they're saying no one's going to appear for the next 2 hours because it's a lunch break, which is what always happens in our work life anytime we need support when it happens there. While this is happening, you have somebody that's going to come to you asking for money. Ends up being a homeless person that doesn't belong in there. and so on and so forth. And so it's not just one threatening situation that occurs. It is a series of obstacles that interfere with your ability to meet the primary goal that you are focused on. And what we know, whether it's parenting, working, spending time with family, or in the workplace, is you might have one primary objective based on your reading of the situation, and then life intervenes and throws you a whole bunch of storms and stressors and really annoying, difficult people. And what they found was with this, the people that performed the best at resolving the problem were those people that were highly anxious, and those people that were emotionally stable actually performed worse. And the reason is there's a couple of things that anxious people do that gives you insight into why it's not so bad being an anxious person, and maybe even better, it's not so bad for hiring someone who seems like an anxious person. And furthermore, your team probably will perform worse, where the group might be worse than the sum of its parts if you don't have a few anxious and neurotic people. And the reason is because they're hyper vigilant to threats or things that might interfere with the work. When they see a threat's going to happen, they get really aroused, which means they're mobilized for action. When they're mobilized for action and they see that there's a problem there, they tend to search for solutions. When they find solutions, they don't just stay with them with themselves. They seek out other people to validate, hey, am I wrong about this? Because I'm worried that we're going in the wrong direction. As they seek out support and that person doesn't listen to them, they tend to squat and stop in that situation until someone listens to them. Now, if you're thinking about this from the perspective of a psychologist, you might say this is problematic or pathological. They are ruminating and their mind is spinning around the problem. There's a way of reframing this as they're not going to stop. They persevere until they find a number of allies who are going to help them figure out what the problem is. And that is exactly who I want on a team if there's an emergency. And that's exactly who I want if I'm at the airline and I forgot my passport and it ends up being I can't figure out how do I get to my flight on time. I want an anxious person who's going to problem solve until this thing is actually resolved.
Such a great story and just such a brilliant countercultural example and just really well put. So, and I like the reframing. So, everyone will have experienced being told you're too anxious. Everyone will have experienced being told, look, stop ruminating about that, right? So, I really like the idea of persevere. And I think there's a technical sciencey word, perseverate, which is it's like rumination, but maybe it's got a slightly different idea around it, which is persevere, right? So maybe we could use perseverate and this idea of persevere when pushing back on rumination.
Yeah, well, rumination has two sides. And I mean, I like the complexity of understanding the human condition. So one side of rumination is that you're really focused on why am I feeling this way? What's wrong with me? And you have this internally directed compass where you're stuck in your head and not focusing on all the beautiful things and all the challenges that are all around you. Now, there's another form of rumination that's much more adaptive, which is basically is you are philosophically attending to all the challenges that are around you, and you're worrying about my present self, my future self, and other people. And so I'm spinning my wheels because there are problems that need to be solved, and there are people and tasks that are being performed at suboptimal levels. So you want that adaptive rumination where you're task focused. You don't want the problematic rumination where you're spinning your wheels trying to find the superhero origin for all the problems that are occurring.
Yeah, makes so much sense. So look, let's come back to Jay's point. So he says here, and it's such beautifully and honestly put, little by little and eventually, anxiety fills in all of your day every day. And it's at this point when you just can't have it anymore. A little bit of anxiety is good as a cortisol spike, but if you're flooded by it, then I'd rather not have it at all. How do you respond to that, Todd?
Yeah, Jay, it's a really good question. I'm going to split this into two parts. So one, and this comes up a lot when I'm talking about anxiety. As a clinical psychologist who spent years treating people with anxiety disorders, it's important to distinguish the two. So when we're talking about anxiety, we're talking about an emotional state that's like in the moment, a mood. The way I think about moods is you can see my a little bit of my one of my bookcases behind me. That's like the wallpaper, the background of your day. So you might wake up and feel energized, excited for the day, but for some strange reason, mentally, the backdrop of your day is that you're just feeling a little bit out of sorts, a little bit like jittery, jolty, but doesn't mean you're not going to have amazing moments of connection, amazing bursts of creativity. But in general, you're just kind of a little bit like out of sorts in some way. So we can have emotional states that deviate from the wallpaper, that anxious mood, where all the emotions, joy, happiness, intrigue, awe, um, we'll get to it later, like flow and excitement, tranquility, even though in general you tend to be anxious. If we extend beyond the day, now we're building the timeline where it's days and weeks and it's interfering with your ability to function in everyday life, we would say that you are moving in the direction of having dysfunctional anxiety. So it's about intensity and frequency, and we're really not really too worried about that until it's days and weeks. And I would actually argue, even still, if it's even days and weeks, we do have to do a little bit of personal reflection of, is there a prominent event in my life that would explain that it's not me necessarily, it is perfectly normal for the situation. So you might have just been told is that over the course of the next 3 months, we're going to downsize 20% of employees in your company. Well, that's a perfectly normal explanation for where anxiety starts to fill your days. A good leader, a good culture would explain to people exactly who is not to worry about what's happening. It won't reduce your anxiety to zero, but to leave everybody with the sense of uncertainty, that's when, Jay, what you're describing is it's going to interfere with productivity, creativity, as well as healthy social interactions.
I think there's a kind of a beautiful connection here with the idea of suppression and avoidance, and but just like transitioning into the next thing. So we all know the havoc that prolonged periods of intense activity can wreak on physical and mental health. That's another quote from your book. Now, anxiety is one, but then let's pick up this really difficult one that people find super hard. To just accept about themselves, like my anger, I'm feeling angry, expressing my anger. I think this is really very, very tough for people. And to see this as okay and normal, I think this is definitely the bad one of the bad ones. Like they're up there with jealousy and hatred, right? So why is anger good?
Yeah, let's go back to an underappreciated scientist from the 1990s, James Averill, who comes up with a great definition of anger that I think just the definition helps us rethink this. Anger is the emotion we experience when something or someone obstructs the goals that are important to us. As soon as you think about that definition, you say to yourself, well, shoot, I definitely need anger in my life. And the other thing about this definition is let's talk about some of the synonyms, which are a little bit like low grade anger. So frustration, disturbed, upset, and then at some of the higher grades of anger, we're talking about pissed, fury, rage. When you start to think about people and things and situations that obstruct my goals, I'll give you a personal example. So when I first married my wife, one of the things that I always said was the reason I do cardiovascular work, elliptical machine, run regularly, is because if someone grabs her physically or steals her purse, I want to know that I could chase after the bad guy or gal for 3.5 miles before my heart drops out. That happens there. And that motivation of imagining that situation. I grew up in New York City, where at a time where there's a little bit higher crime at that point. It was enough motivational fuel for me to do the worst workout ever, which is just run straight on a treadmill for, you know, for 60 minutes to 90 minutes. But I would think about that situation. And because of it, I got physically stronger. And I knew any situation, if someone grabbed my wife, I could chase after him for 3 miles with no problem that happened there. And it's a little bit of a metaphor for your anger is what makes you a great friend. Your anger is what makes you the person that will not let the team down. Because as soon as you see an obstacle or a setback, you say to yourself, I'm going to figure out, do I go through it? Do I go around it? Or do I figure out how to dismantle it? And in this way, I hope by describing this a little bit poetically, is you realize this is a really valuable emotion. You are a really good tribe member if you end up having anger in the service of the group.
Just such a brilliant description. I think the logic of that is unassailable, right? And the way I like to think about all of these things is that they're an energy, like a motivational energy, and then the labels that we give them, the emotional labels, are really contextual. So, I'm going to have some level of intensity in my motivation to do something, and it depends on the context whether that's me having to confront someone. So that would be me needing to motivate into anger to confront in some sort of way and to create the energy to sort of stop something that I want to stop, or make something happen that has been stopped, as you say, like someone who's getting in the way of my needs. So these intensities have these qualities, right, of discomfort, very uncomfortable, but also, lovely and joyful. But they also have just an intensity kind of factor to them. So it's like an energy. And so if they all come from this idea of energy, then in a way, none of them can be bad. They're all just labels for different types of energy, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so let's move to the realm of parenting. In my personal belief, as a dad of 3 daughters, I think one of the things that every parent should be telling their kids and reminding them, and more importantly, showing them behaviorally, is that I will always be there to protect you if it comes to your well-being is at stake. I would sacrifice mine for yours. And they have to see that. You can't just say it as a motto and put it as a very horrible large bumper sticker on your car. And the idea is, I tell my kids who are now in their last year of high school before college, is that there's 6 bullets in the gun. Sorry to use a violent metaphor for this, and that I will use 6 bullets, and I will put anything, teachers, administrators in school, parents, other kids, you have a problem, I will step in. But you only get 6. So choose them wisely for I'm gonna step in that happens there. And regularly they'll tell me how a kid annoyed them, bothered them, like, poking them all the time as they sit behind them in class. And I'm like, do you want to use one of the 6 bullets? Because if so, I'll intervene. And they're like, you know what? Let me save it. And then I'm like, let me, do you want to help you with a skill set to respond to this threat that happens there? This is all in the province of compassionate anger. And that you're saying you're willing to help. They know you're there to help them. And you let them actually discern, is this at the level of threat that I actually want you to use one of the 6 situations? And I kind of suggest this for thinking about this as a leader in the workplace, and in these kind of relationships, is that you don't want people coming to you with every frustration that they have and every problem they have with a coworker. So if you let them know there's a finite number of situations where you're going to be the great white knight that comes in to save them, they will be empowered to think about, is this one where I want someone to intervene, or do I need some skills and to go back in there and actually resolve this myself?
Wonderful. We've got some beautiful questions coming in from Dan and Jay on the chat here. Sometimes I get angry on behalf of colleagues and I can see something unfair happening. I want to advocate, and that leads me to fighting someone else's fight, which is really a difficult position to be in. And then I get anger from that person because they felt I was getting involved and I shouldn't. And then Jay's got this nice kind of add-on from his earlier comment. I love the duality necessary to have context. There's no beauty without ugliness. Polar forces are the source of energy and drives everything that moves in the universe, right? So you have to be willing to open yourself up to the polarities, and that's what's going to move you forwards. Or, energy is going to go somewhere, and you don't want to go inwards, right? You want it to go in a direction. So suppression and self-editing and self-control is, that's where you're going to end up becoming ill because you've not given your energy an outlet, or you're going to maybe let it spill over the wrong person because that's easier to talk to a loved one where you have permission than to talk to the person that you actually need to speak to. So we should get into this idea of why. So like everything you say is true, but nevertheless, you can know it intellectually, but you can still be really avoidant because we all have this, or many people have really strong confrontation bias. It's complicated. While I have really strongly motivated to tackle you over this issue, I also at the same time don't want to look bad to you. I also don't want to look bad to me. Like when I have this energy, I feel it's really hard to control, and I feel like I might accidentally go over the top. I might not do it right because I'm not quite in control of it. So these are all really good complex reasons why, your theoretical answer turns out to be poor in reality. So how do we tackle the complexity of being in an energized state?
Yeah, Jay, Dan, Matthew, these are all really great comments. So one of the things that Robert and I like to talk about is strategically one way of making sure that you don't go over the top, and one way of making sure that someone understands why you're angry is what I call the discomfort caveat, is to open up a conversation. And I've done this in work meetings, I've done this in consultations, I've done this with friends. And sometimes it led to outcomes that I didn't expect, some that I liked and some that I didn't realize they were good until a few months later. Which is to say, is that what we're talking about right now, what you're bringing up to me, is really important and it's disturbing to me. And I need to let you know I have a lot of emotions bubbling up inside me and I'm a little bit surprised. So I hope you bear with me because I might not choose my words wisely. You have this little opening, this caveat, this prelude, choose your favorite word, your preface to the situation. And what you're doing is you're trying to low people's defenses, their guard down a little bit to give you a little bit of charity, such that just as you're saying in the comments, is that I probably won't choose my words wisely. I might be a little bit over the top. Please bear with me. It's just you are triggering, provoking a lot of strong emotions inside me that happens there. Most people who are good people will say, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to actually arouse that much inside you. And listen, I'd love to listen to you. I promise I'm not going to judge what happens, what comes out of your mouth right now. You get to apologize. You get to make mea culpas 24 hours later. I think what's important is that and Nick, this is what you're saying, if we suppress, hide, conceal what it is that bothers us, what's going to happen is we're toxifying the relationship already. So it doesn't matter whether we act on our anger and express it. The relationship is deflating in terms of intimacy. It's deflating
Mhm.
in terms of commitment. We're thinking more about alternatives to these people that we will go to in the future, all
Right.
because we are unwilling to express these uncomfortable, undesirable feelings that happen there. And so my really, short suggestion is that consider having a caveat of explaining that this is something really important to you. So you apologize. That's why you're getting worked up. And then voicing what you're feeling and thinking. Because really, the onus is on the person that's obstructing your goals and blocking what matters to you. It's not really on you when it happens there. And you can work through it. And the thing is, the time frame, unless there's really clearly a deadline, can last for days and weeks for you to resolve this together.
Just so beautifully put. And your point about the relationship is immediately toxic. I think that's such a profound point. So I think when we put up a barrier to expressing ourselves while feeling anger, let's say just to keep it pure, maybe that's a defensive barrier because of all complex fears of not looking bad to you or to me or my mom, or the cultural thing about not expressing your anger. So don't look bad to culturally. Maybe I'm not sure how I'm going to express it, so I feel uncertain. I don't have hopefulness that you'll listen to it well. You'll probably get angry back. All of those things getting messed up in my head, and so I put this barrier up, right? So the barrier is to protect me, but it immediately limits our relation, right? Because and it could be there for days. It could be there for a week while you work that out, right? And so I experienced coldness or withdrawal about this issue for a week because you're protecting, and I don't even get to hear what it was, right? So that makes sense.
Yeah, and just to go on to Converse, and not that I want to spend a lot of time in politics because there's way too much conversation about it, is think about politicians that get angry, but they don't offer a caveat of why, of the fact that they're worked up. It's almost like I want to see evidence from leaders that
Mm.
you acknowledge that you have important values, they've been activated, you're upset about something. And I want you just kind of to show a little bit of self-reflection before you might kind of, lose your marbles a little bit and get really intense very quickly in terms of what you say. And you might actually be very cutting towards other people that happen there. That's so it's worth looking at how people get angry that you're observing and then ask yourself, is that how I'd want to appear? And then do I want to add a strategy that goes in there, such as a discomfort caveat, so that at least I show that I am reflective and thoughtful and have really deep values and a strong moral compass. And that's the reason that I'm angry. And if you leave that out, people can unfortunately easily misinterpret you as you are a curmudgeon, you're problematic, and you're very self-absorbed.
I'm super conscious of time, and that's such a great comment. I just wanted to shout out to Alice because she found this next slide. And on this slide, so you've got this kind of idea. I don't know whether this translates into American, but we have here like a good egg or a bad egg. So, this is stock image, but it's a good egg and bad egg. So this idea of good and bad, and culture, and morals. So these things that people can argue are universal and are qualities that have, goodness in them and badness in them. But you don't talk about that. And I really
Yeah.
relate to that. So are we talking about things which are really good and bad, or is there another way of relating to these?
I'm so glad you're bringing this up because one of the beefs that I've had with scientists for the last, I don't know, 50 years of studying emotional science is creating categories of positive emotions and negative emotions. And while it's
Hey.
a nice, simple frame, I like to think about it as helpful and unhelpful emotions or helpful and unhelpful traits. And I know we don't have time to go into it, but I feel this way about narcissism. I feel this way about psychopathy. I feel about this about Machiavellianism or selfishness is when used in particular situations, it is exactly the right behaviors to enact there. So if I'm talking to a woman in therapy and it ends up being is that she's a people pleaser and is not attending to her own needs and not paying attention to when other people are encroaching on her boundaries, I would say I want to see a little bit more narcissism. I want to see a little bit more selfishness. I want to see a little bit more grandiosity where you showcase and let the world know your strengths. You have to remember when you deconstruct these qualities that are automatically evaluated by society as bad,
Mhm.
in underneath them are really good behaviors for particular situations. And if it's you could think about leaders, there's times of war and times of peace. And when it's times of war, when you are having financial difficulties, you are being pushed out of the market, there are lots of competitors. I want someone that has a little bit of narcissism to bust out and basically take the realm, take the platform, take action. I don't want a narcissistic person. I would there's a place for narcissistic behaviors at a moderate level.
And we haven't got time for the narcissism debate today, but I'm going to leave everyone hanging for another day where we talk about your quote, which is two narcissists are better than one, and just a fabulous link to the approach to creativity. But on this point about narcissism, I think sometimes what can happen is we create a category, let's call it narcissist. We pile on it, saying that's bad. Everyone who's a narcissist is bad. You must not have narcissists in your team, etc., etc. Forgetting that it's a spectrum of behaviors. It's not a thing, right? It's not, there's not one thing which is a narcissist, good, bad, on, off. There's a whole range of behaviors which are in the quality that we call narcissism. There's a whole range of intensities and complexities that it can be mixed up in the paint, right? And so we turn off the category narcissist because it's bad, right? And then we have no access culturally to any of the good things that could be in them. And I think that's your point, and it's such a powerful point. Show me a bit more grandiosity and stand up for yourself here because your needs are not being met. So
Yeah,
for me,
and
The
Yeah,
language
sorry.
here is useful, right? So you use healthy. I think healthy is good. Healthy, unhealthy. I really like useful, not useful, right? Because that allows you to be really nuanced about the environment you're in. So what's useful here? You know,
Oh, hopefully I said helpful and unhelpful. That's actually the
helpful.
phrasing that
Yeah,
I use, which is
yeah,
the same as you.
helpful.
I
Yeah,
mean, I think about it as like when you have young mentees, not in age, but in tenure working at a place, and you find great talent and potential. And often, I'll often say to them, listen, you need to showcase what you're capable of. I see it, but I'm around you all the time. Like,
yeah,
I want you to, I want you, it's almost like I want you to be walking around with a play card sign that says, I have these amazing strengths. I work hard for them, I practice on them, and I'm ready to showcase them to the world. That is a form of narcissism, but
yeah.
it's called actually um, narcissistic admiration, which is that you are admiring yourself for having all these strengths. And I'm giving you feedback saying you should admire yourself. But what you're not doing is narcissistic rivalry, which is you're not pushing other people down and denigrating them and preventing them from getting their benefits. You're focused on maximizing what you can do with this one life that you have. And when you ask the question, what would it be like if you walk through the world with zero level of narcissism and reflect on that? I think many of us will say, I don't want to be at zero. I shouldn't be at zero. And I don't want any friends or colleagues to be at zero because that means you hide what makes you great and what contributions you can give.
I think it's such a beautiful point, and it's so well put and so hard to do for some people to let your light shine. It's so hard to do, but so important and very, very interesting. And I think in this part of the debate, we get into the countercultural. So some of these words that are used in psychology to define these qualities, like the big five, right? We need to work so hard on the countercultural on those because so many of them are judged, right? It's they're judged as being a bad thing. Like narcissism is a good example. But all of them are judged as being good or bad, and we just have to work so hard to recover the phrases because you can't even talk about narcissism without shutting down the conversation in a way. And we need to be able to get into it. And as you say, just there's a whole valuable palette of qualities in there that are useful to grab onto if you could only keep the door open, and not go to extremes. But talking to extremes, I just want to have a minute on this idea of intensity. We're just running up against our time here, but just quickly on intensity, because this is a key part of their full emotional life. And just intensity is like a different quality, I think. You can have this discomfort or comfort. Tell us about this.
Yeah, I like to use a speedometer as a metaphor for thinking about this, where you can think of, and we talked a little bit about this with anger, is minor irritants is like, I guess I have to go to kilometers here to work with a UK audience. So you can think about like 10 kilometers
We're
of
miles. We're fine. It's miles.
so 10 miles per hour is like, I'm irritated. And then 20 miles per hour, you're frustrated. And then 30 miles per hour, you can say you're angry. And then pissed off might be 60 miles per hour. Rage might be 90 miles per hour. So just being really careful to attune to what mile per hour are you at in terms of emotional intensity. And then figure out, just as Bob is talking about in the comments about congruence. Is this emotional state of intensity congruent with what the situation has afforded me? Now, if someone just basically pulled pulled a car in front of me, slammed their brakes, came out of the car, and started yelling at my loved ones who are in the car and me simultaneously, it makes perfect sense that I'm at 90 miles per hour in terms of emotional intensity. You've threatened my family. You're physically in my face in the situation, and you have no idea why I'm driving the way that I'm driving that happens there. In this situation, there is acknowledge what's going on inside you and figure out what is the best course of action that happens there. Now, usually the best course of action is not to deny or avoid or escape that negative emotion, is let them know, I'm going to explain to you exactly why I'm actually in a fit of rage right now. And if you look at my hands, they're actually clenched. You're threatening my loved ones right now. And so let's first move. Let's stop that, have a conversation, you and I on the side. Because as long as you're threatening my loved ones, we're at a state right now where we're not going to be able to have a conversation and figure out the best outcome right now. It's not going to be a good one. And it's not a threat. I'm basically just describing exactly the parameters of what's happening right now. And I'm offering a meta commentary of this could go awry. Let's try not to make it go awry. That happens there. And from there, we can have a negotiation. And one thing that we know as with emotional intensity is that anger tends to be more effective often than being happy or joyous or playful, because the situation is a serious one. In serious situations, negative emotions make us hone in, hyper focus on the situation at hand without letting distractions interfere. Bad when you're trying to be creative, good in a situation when someone's trying to attack you in a given moment and you're working with something that happens there. So I do want to actually say is that yes, when we think about helpful emotions, being of moderate intensity tend to be quite useful. But here's a caveat from even that, is that extremely intense emotions can be very helpful because it allows you a moment to clarify exactly what the situation is, so all parties involved can do their best to get the best possible outcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There's so much that we could jump off onto from here. And I wanted to talk to you about flow state in connection with intensity, but I'm going to do it off the call on the private chat, right? So because there's a really interesting discussion to have about I use tone rather than positive and negative. I like tone. So it has this discomfort tone and this, pleasurable tone. And I think that's much nicer language. But, if you have a tone-free intensity, there's just something to get into there, which I think is kind of a mystery space. But that's for another day. So I'm going to leave everybody hanging on that chapter ending. And yeah, you have to sign into the next chapter to find out what that mystery space is all about. But I just want to thank you so much, Todd, for sharing your thoughts with us today. And thank you, everybody, for the comments that we've had throughout, which have been just fascinating and really good. So just a quick wrap up from me, and then we'll close the recording. So here are Todd's books. So The Art of Insubordination, I think that's the latest one, and The Upside of Your Dark Side, both of which are brilliant. And then you can follow Todd on his Substacks channel in Provoked, called Provoked. So easy to find in there. Go have a look. They're absolutely fabulous. And there's so much more in them from what we've discussed today. We've really just touched the surface of it today. So just fascinating. Next Strategy Cafe after the summer break, we are going to be talking about whether the business model is ready for growth and how to assess that. Whether you're an investor, a managing director, a founder, a family business, are you really ready for growth? And what do you need to think about for that as the economy starts to come good? So that's going to be on the 18th of September, usual time of 8:30. So sign up. You'll be able to find a registration code on the website. In relation to the conversation we're having with Todd today, we have a flexible mindset diagnostic. You can find the diagnostics on our website. This is just a brilliant one. So if those of you want to explore how you rate on 6 factors that assess your flexibility or growth mindset, you can freely do that on our website. And then we'd be delighted to have a conversation with you about that and just take this conversation we're having today a little deeper. So please feel free to go and do that. And then I'm sorry for there's many slides here, but just the last one, just on 8:30 on the 4th of September, I'm going to be running a new masterclass on high pressure leadership, unpacking these topics in leadership contexts. It's the price of a coffee for this one. It's an open forum, so there's places are unlimited, anyone can come. It's on Zoom, and so look on the site and you can find that on the podcasts. Come register and join us for that, and I hope we see some of you on there.